It's Justin here from MyVeloFit. Many people know that saddle height is one of the most important parts of your bike fit, but measuring it can actually be surprisingly tricky. Today, we're going to dive into the nuances of how to measure your saddle height properly to make sure your bikes are set up right every time. Let's dive in.
Welcome to MyVeloFit, the world's first online AI-powered bike fit. Built by bike fitters for all riders.
So we're gonna dig into saddle height, and the first thing that many people miss, basically because of the way saddle height's been explained, is that what you're actually targeting is a body position, not a measurement on your bike. So the measurement on the bike is just the easiest way to replicate that body position, but if you don't do it right, and there's a whole bunch of variables, you can end up in actually quite a bit different saddle position than you might have expected. So you've probably measured saddle height potentially your whole life as from the middle of the bottom bracket or the middle in your cranks to the top of the seat. And that's a great start, but what it kind of leaves out is that the crank arm length, the type of pedals you're using, the shoes you're wearing, specifically the stack height of the shoes and the pedals, and even so much as the type of padding or how firm or thick the padding is on the saddle are all going to impact how your body ends up sitting on the bike. So another thing that impacts your saddle height that's not often discussed is the fore-aft positioning. You can actually have the same saddle height in a multitude of fore-aft positions. So if you're only measuring the saddle height, you can end up with a wildly different saddle position, regardless of if the measurement of that traditional saddle height measurement is exactly the same. So the first thing we're gonna tackle is where to measure on the saddle itself. Obviously a saddle is, it can be in varying lengths, and if you measure at different points on the saddle, and you hold your tape measure, it's gonna give you a different result. So one measurement that's come out relatively recently for how to do this reliably is an anatomical or biomechanical reference point on the saddle. And basically what that is the point on the saddle, we got a saddle here, where your pelvic bone averages the average width of your pelvic bone in a more aerodynamic position. So this has somewhat limited applicability, but it does give us a nice easy reference point, especially when we're measuring across different saddles. So some companies use 70 millimeters, some use 75, some use 80 millimeters. Which one you choose isn't really important. What is important is that you use the same one every time, no matter what saddle you're measuring. So how we're gonna do this, there's a couple different ways. The easy way is a lot of newer saddles actually have it marked. This saddle from Bontrager has a little mark right here, and they're usually somewhere in this part of the saddle, underneath, on the plastic frame, and there'll just be a little notch. Doesn't look like it means anything, but that's their anatomical reference point. The other way to do it, if your saddle doesn't have that, or if you've got multiple saddles, is you can make a quick tool at home. Paper clip, ruler, and we're just gonna pick one of those measurements. We're gonna use 75 millimeters because it's right in the middle. So basically, we're gonna fold the paper clip flat. We'll leave this end bent. So we've got one bent end and a flat paper clip. We'll hold it up against our ruler here, mark 75 millimeters. And again, it doesn't need to be perfect because ideally you're using the same tool every time. So if you got 76 millimeters, it's gonna be 76 millimeters every time. And this is gonna be our reference point marker. And all we're gonna do when we're measuring our saddle height is we're gonna slide this over the saddle so it comes to the point where it's 75 millimeters. Make sure you're not bending it out too wide. I can see on this saddle that the markers on the saddle are a little further back, so Bontrager is probably using 80 millimeters as their reference point. And then every time when you're measuring your saddle height from the cranks to the top of the saddle, we're gonna use this reference point to make sure that we're getting a consistent measurement every time. Let's jump over to the bike, and we're gonna demonstrate 3 different saddle positions that are all exactly the same saddle height, but the different fore-aft position makes my overall position on the bike quite a bit different. All right, so we're gonna start by putting our reference marker onto the saddle. We've got a little tape measure here. Once the marker's on and you're happy with that placement, we're just gonna start at the top of the marker, and we're gonna move down to the cranks. Now, a lot of people may try and guesstimate a spot in the middle of the crank, but I actually find measuring to the top of the hole, a lot of cranks have a kind of a big axle spindle hole like this now, and then just adding half the diameter of that spindle hole afterwards is gonna give you a nice reliable measurement. So make sure you know your crank arm length when you're setting your saddle height. On this Wahoo bike, it's pretty easy. They've got it nicely labeled, but on your cranks on your bike, it's likely labeled on the backside of the crank, sometimes engraved, but it should be there. All right, so this is my baseline position. It's pretty similar to the position on my road bike. We're just gonna be using this as a reference point. My saddle height as measured is that we're gonna be using as a reference is 765 millimeters. And so we'll start here and then we're gonna show 2 more positions, both with 765 millimeter saddle heights, but you'll see the overall position changes quite dramatically. So let's go. All right, so I have moved the saddle rearward by 2 centimeters, 20 millimeters. And so now I'm just lowering the saddle height to achieve the same overall effective saddle height with this new saddle position. So they're gonna measure, there we go. They're gonna measure hopefully exactly the same, or we'll make them exactly the same. And yeah, there we go. So let's see how this pans out. This is the second position. We've moved the saddle rearward 2 centimeters. We've also lowered the saddle, so the actual measured saddle height is exactly the same before, 765 millimeters, but quite a bit of a different saddle position overall. All right, so now we're gonna move the saddle 4 centimeters forward, so it's gonna be 2 centimeters ahead of where we started. And 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. All right, so we've adjusted the fore-aft, and now we're just gonna have to raise the seat post height to compensate to achieve our same overall saddle height. So we're just gonna check the measurement now, and then we'll raise the saddle height to make sure it measures the same as before at 765 millimeters. Wow, that's quite a bit low, so we'll bring it up quite a bit. All right, so this is the third position. We're 2 centimeters forward of our starting place and 4 centimeters forward of where we started in terms of saddle fore-aft. I've brought the saddle up considerably. It probably had to come up about 1.5 centimeters, 15 millimeters, so that we're at a measured saddle height of 765, so consistent with the other 2 positions. So hopefully you've got a much better understanding now of how to measure your saddle height properly. But just as a recap for the next time you're measuring your saddle height or transferring it to a new bike, these are some of the things we want you to keep in mind. Remember to measure your saddle height at the same point on the saddle every time. Use a reference point, doesn't matter what it is, but use the same one every time. Make sure you're measuring from the same point at the cranks every time. This can actually impact your saddle height pretty significantly, and it can be a little tricky to find that right point. Make sure the saddles you're comparing when measuring saddle height are either the same or very similar. Differences in padding or even just overall shape can actually impact how you sit on them pretty significantly, so the measured saddle height you'll have on the bike could be quite a bit different. Make sure the shoes and pedals you're using are the same or impact your measurements accordingly. And remember that your cleat position also impacts your saddle height. So if you've got one bike with a slightly different cleat setup than the other bike, you might want to keep that in mind when transferring saddle height. And finally, don't get too caught up in being millimeter perfect. It's going to be really hard to do it super accurately, even in the best of conditions. So usually for most people, if you're within a couple millimeters, you're not going to notice when you're out riding. And if you do, just kind of tweak to feel. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this helped you understand your fit a little bit better, and specifically your saddle height. If you've got any comments or questions, leave them in the comment section below. Like and subscribe for more content like this, and you can follow us anywhere on socials at MyVeloFit. Until next time.